You had some writings in the past that helped me a lot, and I wanted to ask you about the one called Science and the Bible, where in that writing you demonstrate that the Bible and science are not at odds, while in fact Bible continue at attest to what we discover in nature, for example. So can you share a little bit of that book?
Yeah, actually, the name of the book is There a God? I have a PhD in chemical physics, so it seems that people ask me to speak on this topic fairly often. In fact, I'm going to do a presentation tomorrow morning at UCLA for a campus group on science and God. The book is broken down into two parts. The first half of the book is essentially a defense of the existence of God, and kind of to show that the idea that as a scientist, belief in God is the most rational view. So in the first half of the book, I'm not defending Christianity per se, but I'm trying to get people to think rationally about God and what we know about God and what we know about science and about nature, and to show that by far the most rational view is that the universe is created. And so I don't know what you come across there in Romania or the subscribers to your website, but here in America there's a common view that the Bible teaches the earth is only a few thousand years old, and that science actually agrees with this. And, unfortunately here in America I have to, to some extent, deal with that issue, and I can't simply do what I'd like to do, which is talk about how, what we know from science tells us about God. So in the book, I talk about how, possibly God could have created the earth to appear old, but the fact is the earth appears old. So, possibly the literal interpretation of Genesis makes sense, I suppose. God could have created the earth in 6 24-hour periods, and he could have put dinosaur fossils in the ground, and he could have put light from stars that are 3 billion light years away already on path to the earth. But the bottom line is, the only rational interpretation of the evidence is the universe and the earth are very, very old. At least they certainly appear that way. And so then I talk about how if we take a different view of Genesis, which is perfectly reasonable, and even theologians in the first century agreed with this, which is that these represent periods of time over which God worked. So first God created light, and then he created the sun and the planets and life, first in the water, then on the land, and last of all he created the most complex life form, which is human beings. So I would argue that Genesis 1, which is principally a theological treatise, that the basic outline agrees with everything we know from the Bible. Anyway, then I talk about how, as a scientist, I look at how all the laws of nature are incredibly well designed so that we could be here, and talk about, the fine-tuning of the universe, that the force of gravity is insanely precisely set so that planets and galaxies could exist. If the force of gravity was, about 1 part in 10 to the 60th stronger or weaker than it is, then we wouldn't even be here. And in fact, every single force in nature, if it was changed ever so slightly, there'd be no life, there'd be no planets, there'd be no galaxies. And in fact, God's fingerprint is everywhere you look in nature. I spent some time in the book talking about the periodic chart and all the different elements, which if you change one property of one element the slightest amount, again, there'd be no life. I could talk about just the properties of water. I could talk about those for an hour alone. Anyway, I see God's fingerprints all over the periodic chart, all over cosmology. The Bible says, God said, let there be light, and then the Big Bang model says, essentially, God said, let there be light. And Hebrews 11:3 says, we know that what is seen was created from what is unseen. And that's exactly what physics tells us. So, to me, the idea that science and Christianity, or even belief in God, are, that they don't agree, it borders on ludicrous. In fact, just tomorrow night we're going to have a debate between Douglas Jacoby and Michael Shermer we'll make that available. And I'm sure you'll find out if you get a hold of this, we're calling it a dialogue with a skeptic, that the skeptical view just doesn't make sense in light of what we know from science. I'm sure that's one of the points that Doug's going to make. Anyway, and then the second half of the book, I talk about evidence from the scriptures that show that they seem to be not only inspired by God, but that there's scientific wisdom in the scriptures. And I talk about things like where the Bible says these kinds of meat you can eat. This is the Old Testament, of course. These kinds of meat you can eat, these you can't. And the ones that God told them not to eat generally are quite dangerous, and many, many diseases can come from eating those meats. And yet the flesh that God said they could eat, such as fish and beef, are relatively safe, even eaten raw. Or, the fact that God said to circumcise and the health benefits of circumcision, and the fact that he said to circumcise on the 8th day. And the fact is that infants, when they're born, they don't have sufficient vitamin K because the vitamin K doesn't pass from the mother to the child. And then it turns out if you study the formation of vitamin K and prothrombin, the protein produced from it, turns out about the 8th or 9th day, the blood clotting proteins reach a maximum. And that's at the point at which circumcision is relatively safe. So anyway, I don't have time to go into all the details, but there's so many things in the Old Testament which it doesn't make sense that Moses or anybody else would have known these things, and yet from medical science we know that they make sense. So anyway, I wish I could, we only have about 10 or 15 minutes to tell about each book, but I just invite people to consider looking at it. And if you can't get a copy of the book, a lot of this stuff is at my website. You could go to the evidenceforchristianity.org and download a PowerPoint or an outline on this topic. I think it's called God and Science.